For more than 500 years, we have been told a simple story about the Amazon. That no large civilizations ever lived there, that the forest was too dense, the soil too poor, and the environment too unforgiving to support complex societies. Yet in the year 1541, a man drifting down the Amazon River recorded something that should not have existed. He described long stretches of populated riverbanks, organized communities, a landscape shaped by human hands. For centuries, historians said he was exaggerating, or lying, because no such world could survive in a place like this. There are places on Earth that don't just hide history, they erase it. The Amazon is one of them. From above, it looks timeless, an endless green canopy, rivers cutting through the forest like veins of silver, clouds drifting slowly as if the land itself is breathing. It feels ancient, untouched, permanent. But step inside and that impression fades quickly. In the rainforest, time does not pass quietly. It works against everything that stands still. Heat accelerates decay, moisture seeps into every surface, fungi and bacteria break down wood and fiber with remarkable efficiency. Roots move like slow muscles, lifting, cracking, and pulling apart whatever lies in their way. And then there is the water. The Amazon is not a single river, but a living system. It floods, it retreats, it shifts course. Riverbanks collapse and reform somewhere else. Layers of sediment bury what once stood on the surface. Over time, the landscape rewrites itself. In a place like this, nothing fragile survives for long. Wood rots, rope dissolves, earthworks soften. Even stone can sink or disappear under centuries of movement. The jungle does not preserve, it recycles. This is why the Amazon has long been called a green hell, not only because it is dangerous to cross, but because it seems hostile to permanence. For generations, many outsiders believed this environment made complex societies impossible. The reasoning seemed straightforward. The soil was said to be poor, the forest too dense, the climate too unforgiving. People, it was assumed, could only live here in small, scattered groups, moving lightly through the land, never settling long enough to build anything lasting. In that view, the Amazon was a barrier to civilization, a place where history could happen but never accumulate. And if you judge civilization only by what remains visible, stone walls, towering monuments, ruins that endure for thousands of years, the Amazon appears empty. But absence is a dangerous thing to interpret. Not seeing evidence is not the same as evidence never existing, especially in an environment that actively destroys traces of the past. If a landscape erases what people build, then the lack of ruins tells us very little about what once stood there. It may only tell us that we are looking in the wrong way. And once an idea takes hold, that a place cannot support complexity, it becomes a filter. You stop searching for certain patterns. You stop asking certain questions. You assume the forest is natural rather than shaped. You see wilderness, not design. That assumption would shape our understanding of the Amazon for centuries. But there's a problem. Early historical accounts describe a very different river, a populated river. A river lined with communities, fields, and organized settlements stretching far beyond what anyone expected to find. Those accounts would later be dismissed as exaggeration. Yet today, with new tools and new evidence, a different possibility is emerging. What if the Amazon did support complex societies? What if the forest we see today grew back over something far older? And what if the greatest mistake we made was assuming that because we could not see the past, it was never there at all? In 1541, the Amazon was not a destination. It was an obstacle. A Spanish expedition led by Gonzalo Pizarro entered the jungle searching for food, gold, and rumors of a rich land to the east. They found none of it. What they did find was hunger, disease, and exhaustion. As supplies collapsed, a small group was sent ahead to find food and return. That group was led by Francisco de Orellana. They never came back. Instead, pushed forward by current and circumstance, Orellana and his men drifted into something no European had ever fully experienced before: a continuous journey down the length of the Amazon River. What followed was not exploration in the modern sense. It was survival. The men were starving. Many were sick. They had no maps, no reliable way back upstream. The river decided their direction. And yet, as they moved eastward, something unexpected appeared along the banks. According to Orellana's own account, the river was not empty. He described settlements appearing one after another, villages so close together that smoke from cooking fires could be seen for miles, canoes moving with purpose, fields near the riverbanks, organized resistance from groups that understood the terrain better than any outsider could. These were not fleeting encounters with isolated bands. Orellana wrote of sustained contact, days, sometimes weeks, passing populated stretches of river. He described societies that seemed structured, coordinated, and numerous enough to pose real danger to his men. At one point, his expedition was attacked repeatedly from the shore, not chaotically, but deliberately. This was not the behavior of a sparse nomadic population. When Orellana finally emerged from the Amazon and returned to the Spanish world, his report caused confusion and suspicion. He claimed the river supported large populations, that people lived along it in organized communities, that the Amazon was not an empty wilderness. For a brief moment, Europe listened. Then others tried to follow, and that is where the story turned. Later expeditions entered the Amazon expecting to find what Orellana described. They did not. Instead, they encountered long stretches of forest that appeared empty. Sparse populations, no obvious cities, no permanent structures that matched the scale of his claims. The conclusion seemed obvious. Orellana must have exaggerated. Some said he invented the story to protect himself from accusations of abandoning Pizarro. Others believed hunger and fear distorted what he saw. A few suggested he had mistaken temporary encampments for permanent settlements. Over time, his account was quietly pushed aside, and a new consensus formed. The Amazon had never supported large, complex societies. It could not. The environment would not allow it. Orellana's story became a historical curiosity, interesting, but unreliable. But there is a problem with that conclusion. Because the failure of later expeditions to see the same world does not necessarily mean that world never existed. It may simply mean it was gone. If disease swept through river communities shortly after European contact, populations could collapse within a single generation. Without people to maintain fields, paths, canals, and clearings, the forest would move quickly. In the Amazon, abandonment is not slow. Within years, vegetation closes in. Within decades, structures soften and sink. Within a century, a lived-in landscape can look untouched. So the question is not whether Orellana's account matches what explorers saw later. The question is whether anyone expected the Amazon to preserve what it erased so efficiently. Because if Orellana truly passed a populated river in 1541, and that population collapsed soon after, then history would record exactly what it did. One man describing a world that vanished almost as soon as it was seen. When historians dismissed Orellana's account, they believed they were being careful, skeptical, scientific. Extraordinary claims, after all, require extraordinary evidence. And in the Amazon, that evidence seemed to be missing. No stone cities, no towering ruins, no inscriptions carved to last. So the conclusion felt reasonable. If complex societies had existed here, surely something would remain. But that reasoning hides a critical flaw. It assumes that all environments preserve the past in the same way. They do not. Archaeology, at its core, depends on survival. What we know about ancient civilizations is shaped not only by what people built, but by what their environment allowed to endure. Dry deserts preserve bone, fabric, and stone. Cold climates slow decay. Stable ground protects layers of time like pages in a book. The Amazon offers none of those conditions. Here, organic material decomposes rapidly. Soil is acidic. Water is constant. Plants grow aggressively. The ground itself is unstable, shifting with floods and sediment. Layers mix. Edges blur. In such a place, the archaeological record behaves differently. Structures made of wood and earth, perfectly functional and durable within a living society, leave little trace once abandoned. Without continuous maintenance, they soften, collapse, and merge back into the landscape. From the perspective of a later observer, it can look as if nothing was ever there. This creates a dangerous illusion. The absence of visible ruins is mistaken for the absence of people. But absence is not neutral evidence. It reflects conditions, not conclusions. In the Amazon, a society could be large, organized, and long-lived, and still leave behind almost nothing recognizable after a few centuries of abandonment. That reality forces an uncomfortable question. If our methods are tuned to detect stone, and this landscape erases stone-like permanence, how many societies have we simply failed to see? For most of modern history, researchers approached the Amazon with expectations shaped by other parts of the world. They looked for cities that resembled Rome, roads that resembled Europe, agriculture that resembled open fields. When they didn't find those things, they assumed failure. But what if Amazonian societies solved different problems in different ways? What if they built with materials that made sense here? What if they organized space without walls? What if their infrastructure was subtle, woven into the land rather than imposed upon it? Those questions were rarely asked because the evidence was difficult to recognize and even harder to prove. And so the Amazon was labeled pristine, untouched, a wilderness shaped only by nature. Yet this idea created a paradox, because early European accounts consistently described landscapes that were not pristine at all. They describe managed plants, modified riverbanks, food-producing forests. Human activity spread across vast distances. Two stories emerged, and for centuries they could not be reconciled. Either the early accounts were wrong, or modern archaeology was missing something fundamental. For a long time, the first option felt safer, until technology gave us a way to ask a different question. Not, what can we see on the surface, but what lies beneath the forest itself? Because if the Amazon erased the past horizontally, across the land, then the only way forward was to look vertically, through the canopy, through the vegetation, down to the shape of the ground. And when researchers finally did that, the ground began to tell a very different story. For most of the 20th century, the problem remained unsolved. Researchers knew the Amazon was difficult. They knew preservation was poor. But without visible ruins, there was no reliable way to test whether large-scale human organization had ever existed beneath the forest. Then, quietly, that changed. Not through a new theory, but through a new way of seeing. The breakthrough came from a technology that had nothing to do with archaeology at first. It was developed for mapping terrain, guiding aircraft, and measuring landscapes with precision. It was called LIDAR. Light detection and ranging. The idea is deceptively simple. A sensor mounted on an aircraft fires millions of laser pulses toward the ground. Most of those pulses strike leaves, branches, and vegetation, but a fraction slip through gaps in the canopy and reach the surface below. Those returning signals are recorded, measured, mapped, and when the data is processed, the vegetation can be digitally removed. What remains is the bare shape of the land itself, not photographs, not guesswork, but geometry. When archaeologists first applied LIDAR in tropical regions, the results were immediate and unsettling. Beneath forests long assumed to be untouched, patterns began to appear. Straight lines where nature rarely makes them, geometric shapes, raised platforms, depressions that followed logic, not erosion. Features invisible at ground level suddenly stood out with clarity. This was not imagination. This was not interpretation. These were modifications to the landscape. And when LIDAR was finally used at scale in parts of the Amazon basin, the old assumptions began to collapse. Researchers expected to find isolated sites, small clusters of human activity. What they saw instead were networks, connected earthworks, planned layouts, settlements arranged around central hubs. In some regions, LIDAR revealed extensive systems of raised ground, causeways, and canals, structures designed to manage water in a landscape defined by flooding. These were not temporary solutions. They required coordination, planning, maintenance over generations. In other words, they required society. The implications were difficult to ignore. If such features existed beneath the forest, then the Amazon was not merely a backdrop for human survival. It was a landscape that had been deliberately shaped, engineered. And crucially, these discoveries explained something that had long puzzled historians. Why early explorers described dense populations, while later observers found emptiness. Because what LIDAR showed was not stone cities waiting to be uncovered. It showed something more fragile and more easily erased. Earthworks, wooden structures, living infrastructure tied to constant human care. Once abandoned, these systems would not endure like pyramids or temples. They would soften, flood, and vanish beneath vegetation. LIDAR did not prove that every part of the Amazon was heavily populated, but it proved something just as important. Large-scale human modification was not only possible here, it had already happened, and it forced researchers to confront a new reality. The question was no longer whether complex societies could exist in the Amazon. The question was how many had existed, and how much of their world had disappeared before we learned how to look for it. One discovery in particular would bring this realization into sharp focus. It came from a region long dismissed as marginal, a place of seasonal floods and open plains, a place called Llanos de Mojos, and within it, evidence of a society whose scale no one had expected to find. A culture that would soon challenge everything we thought we knew about the Amazon. Llanos de Mojos lies in the southwestern Amazon basin, in what is now Bolivia. For a long time, it was not considered promising ground for major archaeological discoveries. The region floods seasonally. Large areas turn into wetlands for months at a time. From the air, it looks flat, open, and unremarkable. Certainly not the kind of place where anyone expected to find evidence of complex urban organization. And yet, this was exactly where researchers decided to look more closely. When LIDAR surveys were conducted over parts of Llanos de Mojos, the results were immediate and difficult to dismiss. As the vegetation was digitally stripped away, the ground beneath revealed patterns that did not belong to nature. Large raised platforms appeared, some more than 20 meters high. Broad, straight causeways connected these platforms across the floodplain. Circular and rectangular enclosures emerged, arranged with deliberate spacing and orientation. These were not isolated features. They formed networks. At the center of each network stood a large settlement mound, surrounded by smaller satellite sites, all linked by engineered pathways. The layout was consistent across the region, suggesting a shared plan rather than independent accidental development. Archaeologists named the society responsible for these constructions the Casarabe culture, after the region where the most striking evidence was found. What made the discovery so important was not just the presence of earthworks, but their scale. The largest sites covered several square kilometers. The infrastructure extended far beyond individual settlements, integrating multiple communities into a single system. Water management features, canals, reservoirs, and raised agricultural areas suggested long-term planning in a flood-prone environment. This was not survival. This was design. To build and maintain such structures would have required a large labor force, coordination across generations, and a shared understanding of space and purpose. These were not the marks of small, temporary groups moving through the forest. They were the marks of an organized society. And the timeline only deepened the surprise. Radiocarbon dating placed the Casarabe culture between roughly 500 and 1400 CE. That meant these communities thrived for centuries, long before European contact and long enough to develop complex social systems adapted specifically to Amazonian conditions. This forced a reassessment of earlier assumptions. If the soil was truly too poor to support large populations, how did these communities sustain themselves? If the environment was too unstable for permanent settlement, how did they maintain large-scale infrastructure over hundreds of years? And perhaps most unsettling of all, if such societies existed here, in a region once dismissed as marginal, how many others had gone unnoticed elsewhere in the Amazon? The Casarabe discovery did not stand alone. Instead, it acted like a key, unlocking reinterpretations of scattered clues that had been found decades earlier but never fully understood. Earthworks, once thought to be natural, soil anomalies dismissed as coincidence, patterns too subtle to interpret without a broader framework. Now, they began to align. The Amazon was not a blank slate interrupted by humans. It was a landscape that had been shaped, organized, and maintained by people who understood its rhythms far better than any outsider. And as researchers examined the Casarabe sites more closely, one question rose above all others. How did they feed themselves? Because beneath every complex society lies a simple requirement: food. And in the Amazon, the answer to that question would lead to one of the most unexpected discoveries of all. At first, some researchers wondered whether the Casarabe sites were exceptional, an unusual concentration of activity in an otherwise sparsely populated region. That explanation did not survive close examination. As more LIDAR data was analyzed, a consistent pattern emerged. The Casarabe settlements were not scattered randomly across the landscape. They followed a clear hierarchy. Large central sites dominated the system. These hubs were surrounded by smaller settlements, which in turn were linked by raised causeways and engineered corridors. Distances between sites were not accidental. They were regular, measured, and repeated across the region. This was not the footprint of independent villages. It was a network. The scale of coordination implied by that network is difficult to overstate. Building raised platforms in flood-prone terrain requires massive earth movement. Maintaining causeways across wetlands requires constant upkeep. Aligning multiple communities into a shared spatial plan requires leadership, communication, and social agreement. In other words, organization. The Casarabe landscape shows evidence of planning that unfolded over generations. Settlements were expanded, connections were reinforced, agricultural zones were modified as environmental conditions changed. This was not a one-time construction effort. It was a living system. Equally important is what these settlements were not. They were not defensive strongholds. There is little evidence of walls or fortifications designed to repel large-scale warfare. Instead, the infrastructure appears focused on movement, access, and integration. Roads connect outward, not inward. Canals distribute water, not isolate it. Central spaces suggest gathering, not separation. This points toward a form of social organization built around cooperation rather than constant conflict. A society optimized not for conquest, but for resilience within a demanding environment. And that environment mattered. Seasonal flooding could devastate unprepared communities. Yet the Casarabe did not avoid floodplains. They adapted to them. Raised fields allowed crops to survive periods of inundation. Causeways ensured year-round movement between sites. Water management systems controlled excess rather than fighting it. Such adaptations suggest deep environmental knowledge. This was not a society experimenting blindly. It was one that understood the rhythms of the Amazon and designed its settlements accordingly. And then there is population. While exact numbers are difficult to estimate, the density of infrastructure indicates far more people than previously believed possible in this region. Not tens or hundreds, but likely thousands spread across interconnected settlements. This alone challenges the long-standing assumption that Amazonian societies were inherently small. But the most telling detail lies beneath the surface, the soil itself. Across Casarabe sites, researchers identified extensive areas of unusually dark, fertile earth, soil that did not match the surrounding natural profile. Soil enriched over long periods through human activity. This was not an accident. It was a signature. The Casarabe were not merely living on the land, they were transforming it, improving it, making it more productive over time. And that realization forces a crucial shift in perspective. These communities were not surviving despite the Amazon. They were thriving because they understood how to work with it. Which means the question is no longer whether the Casarabe were an anomaly. The question is whether they represent just one example of a broader pattern, one repeated across the Amazon basin in different forms, now largely hidden beneath the forest. And to understand how such societies sustains themselves for centuries, we have to look closer at the soil they created. Because within that dark earth lies the key to how the Amazon once supported populations far larger than anyone thought possible. For decades, the Amazon posed the same problem to researchers. They suspected something was missing, but they had no reliable way to prove it. On the ground, visibility was limited to a few meters. Thick vegetation blocked the view. Subtle changes in elevation were masked by roots, leaf litter, and erosion. From satellite imagery, the forest appeared uniform, hiding whatever lay beneath. Traditional archaeology struggled here, not because the questions were wrong, but because the tools were. That began to change with a technology that was never designed to study ancient societies. It was designed to measure landscapes. LIDAR, short for light detection and ranging, works by firing millions of laser pulses from an aircraft toward the ground. Most of those pulses strike leaves and branches, but some pass through small gaps in the canopy and reach the surface below. Each returning pulse records distance and elevation. When enough of them are collected, they form a precise three-dimensional model of the terrain. The key innovation is what happens next. Using software, researchers can digitally remove vegetation from the data. Trees vanish. Bushes disappear. What remains is the bare shape of the land, its rises, depressions, edges, and contours. For the first time, archaeologists could see tropical landscapes as if the forest were not there. When LIDAR was first applied in parts of Central America, the results were startling. Entire cities emerged beneath the canopy. Roads, platforms, plazas, features invisible from the ground. That success raised an obvious question. If LIDAR could reveal hidden urban landscapes elsewhere, what might it uncover in the Amazon? The first large-scale surveys answered that question quickly. Beneath regions long described as untouched, geometric patterns appeared. Straight lines cut across floodplains. Rectangular platforms rose above surrounding terrain. Circular enclosures and connected corridors formed shapes that erosion alone could not explain. Nature does not produce symmetry at this scale. These features were human-made. Even more surprising was how extensive they were. Instead of isolated sites, LIDAR revealed networks, settlements connected by causeways, arranged around central hubs, spread across vast areas. In some regions, the modifications were subtle. In others, they were unmistakable. Raised roads crossed wetlands. Artificial mounds stood above seasonal floods. Channels redirected water with deliberate precision. This was infrastructure, and infrastructure implies planning. It implies coordination. It implies maintenance. It implies society. Perhaps most importantly, LIDAR explained why earlier researchers had missed these patterns entirely. From the ground, the features blended into the environment. A raised platform looked like a natural rise. A causeway felt like slightly firmer soil. Over centuries, vegetation softened edges and blurred outlines. Without an aerial view, the logic of the landscape was impossible to see. LIDAR changed that. It allowed researchers to stop asking, "What can we find?" and start asking, "What was built here?" The difference was profound, because once the forest was removed from the equation, the Amazon no longer looked empty. It looked organized. And as LIDAR surveys expanded, one thing became increasingly clear. The discoveries were not anomalies. They were patterns. Patterns that suggested the Amazon was not a passive backdrop for human survival, but a landscape actively shaped, engineered, and maintained by people over centuries. In the next stage of this story, those patterns would converge in one place, revealing a society whose scale and sophistication would force historians to rethink what Amazonian civilization truly looked like. As LIDAR surveys expanded across different regions of the Amazon, the implications became impossible to ignore. What initially appeared to be isolated discoveries began to form a coherent picture. Similar patterns emerged in distant locations, separated by hundreds of kilometers. Raised platforms, straight causeways, geometric enclosures, water control features aligned with seasonal flooding. These were not accidents of terrain, they were solutions. Each region showed variations shaped by local conditions, but the underlying logic was consistent. People were modifying the land to manage water, movement, and food production at scale. They were not reacting passively to the environment, they were actively organizing it. This forced a fundamental shift in how researchers interpreted Amazonian history. For decades, archaeological thinking had been shaped by visibility. Sites that left stone ruins were studied. Sites that did not were often overlooked or underestimated. LIDAR removed that bias. It revealed that complexity does not always announce itself with monuments. In the Amazon, complexity was written into the ground itself. Equally important was what LIDAR did not show. There were no massive defensive walls, no centralized stone capitals dominating the landscape. Instead, the features pointed toward distributed systems, networks of settlements connected rather than controlled. This suggested a form of social organization different from the empires most people are familiar with. Power was likely spread across regions rather than concentrated in a single city. Coordination mattered more than conquest. Infrastructure was designed to integrate communities, not isolate them. Such systems are easy to miss if one is only searching for the familiar shapes of old-world civilization. LIDAR made it possible to see an Amazonian model of complexity on its own terms, and once that door was opened, old assumptions began to fall apart. The idea that Amazonian soils were universally too poor to support large populations no longer held. The scale of infrastructure implied sustained food production. The extent of settlement networks implied demographic stability over long periods. These landscapes were not fleeting experiments. They were the result of centuries of accumulated knowledge. Another consequence of the LIDAR revolution was more subtle but equally important. It reframed the accounts of early European explorers. Descriptions once dismissed as exaggeration now appeared plausible. A river lined with communities, managed landscapes stretching beyond the horizon, organized populations capable of coordinated action. These were no longer fantasies written by desperate men. They were observations made at the end of a world that was about to collapse. Because LIDAR also made clear how fragile these systems were once abandoned. Remove the people, and maintenance stops. Canals clog, Raised fields erode, causeways soften, vegetation closes in. Within decades, the logic of the landscape dissolves. Within centuries, it becomes invisible. This explains why later explorers found emptiness where earlier ones saw density, not because the Amazon was never populated, but because it was repopulated by the forest. The LIDAR revolution did not uncover a lost empire in the traditional sense. What it uncovered was something more challenging, a civilization without stone cities, a civilization without written records, a civilization adapted perfectly to an environment that erases permanence. And that realization raises a deeper question. If people were capable of reshaping the Amazon at this scale, sustaining large populations for centuries, then the true foundation of these societies was not architecture. It was agriculture. To understand how the Amazon once supported complex networks of communities, we must look not at what stood above the ground, but at what was created within it. Because buried beneath the forest floor lies a form of soil so unusual, so fertile, that it should not exist naturally here at all. And yet it does. When researchers began to examine the LIDAR data more closely, one pattern stood out with unusual clarity. It was not a single site. It was not an isolated anomaly. It was a system. In the southwestern Amazon basin, across a region known as Llanos de Mojos, LIDAR revealed a network of settlements so consistent in form and scale that coincidence could be ruled out. The culture responsible for these constructions is now known as the Casarabe. For much of the year, Llanos de Mojos floods. Water spreads across the plains, transforming the landscape into a vast wetland. To early observers, this seasonal instability made the region seem unsuitable for permanent settlement, let alone complex social organization. The Casarabe evidence tells a different story. At the center of each settlement cluster stood a large raised platform, some rising more than 20 meters above the surrounding terrain. These platforms were not natural hills. Their shapes were too regular, their placement too deliberate. Around them, smaller mounds appeared, arranged in planned layouts. Broad causeways connected these sites across flood-prone ground, maintaining access even during the wet season. In several locations, canals and reservoirs were integrated into the system, directing water rather than resisting it. This was not improvisation. It was engineering. What makes the Casarabe culture especially significant is the consistency of its design. Across wide distances, settlements follow similar spatial rules. Central hubs anchor regional networks. Peripheral sites connect back to these hubs through raised corridors. Distances between sites repeat with striking regularity. Such patterns imply shared planning principles, knowledge passed down, refined, and maintained over generations. Radiocarbon dating places the Casarabe culture roughly between 500 and 1400 CE. That is nearly 1,000 years of continuous occupation, long enough for population growth, social stratification, and institutional memory. In other words, long enough to develop complexity. Yet the Casarabe did not build in stone. Their architecture relied on earth, wood, and organic materials, perfectly suited to the Amazon, but poorly suited to long-term preservation once abandoned. This choice has consequences for how history remembers them. Without walls to crumble or temples to endure, their presence faded quickly after collapse. Vegetation softened their structures, floods reshaped their edges. Over time, what remained blended into the landscape, until LIDAR stripped the forest away. And when it did, the scale of Casarabe organization became undeniable. These were not villages struggling at the edge of survival. They were coordinated communities embedded in a broader regional system. A society capable of moving large volumes of earth, of planning infrastructure across generations, of maintaining networks that extended far beyond individual households. This realization challenges a long-standing assumption. that Amazonian societies were inherently small, isolated, and transient. The Casarabe were none of those things. They were stable, they were organized, they were persistent. And yet one question remains unanswered. How did they sustain themselves? Because no matter how well a society is planned, it cannot exist without reliable food production. And in the Amazon, where soils are often described as nutrient poor, this question becomes critical. The answer does not lie in imported crops or fleeting abundance. It lies in something far more surprising. Something created deliberately, patiently, and invisibly, beneath the ground itself. As researchers mapped more Casarabe sites, one conclusion became increasingly difficult to avoid. This was not a marginal society. The scale of construction alone demands explanation. Moving and shaping Earth on this level requires sustained labor, organized, coordinated, and repeated over long periods of time. A single platform might take years to build. A network of platforms, causeways, canals, and reservoirs requires something far more demanding. It requires people. And not just a few. While precise population estimates remain uncertain, the density and extent of Casarabe infrastructure suggest communities numbering in the thousands, spread across interconnected settlements. These were not isolated villages separated by wilderness. They were parts of a continuous human landscape. What makes this especially important is how the system functioned as a whole. Casarabe settlements were arranged hierarchically. Large central sites acted as hubs, places of ceremony, coordination, and exchange. Smaller sites surrounded them, linked by raised causeways that ensured movement even during seasonal floods. This pattern appears again and again. It implies regional planning rather than local improvisation. Decisions made at one site influenced construction at others. Knowledge was shared. Standards were maintained. Such coordination does not emerge spontaneously. It reflects social structures capable of organizing labor, managing resources, and resolving conflict over long periods of time. Equally revealing is the absence of heavy fortifications. Casarabe sites show little evidence of defensive walls or militarized layouts. Instead, the infrastructure emphasizes connection rather than separation. Roads lead outward. Canals distribute water across the landscape. Central spaces are open rather than enclosed. This suggests a society oriented toward cooperation and integration, not constant warfare. That does not mean conflict was absent, but it does suggest that Casarabe stability was built on social cohesion rather than coercive control. And then there's the question of time. Radiocarbon evidence shows that Casarabe communities were occupied for centuries. This was not a brief fluorescence followed by rapid collapse. It was a long-lived system, resilient enough to adapt to environmental change and demographic pressure. To survive that long, food production had to be reliable. Yet the soils of the Amazon are often described as inherently poor, thin, acidic, and easily exhausted. Conventional agriculture struggles here. Without intervention, productivity declines quickly. The Casarabe solution was not to abandon the land. It was to transform it. Across many sites, archaeologists identified areas of dark, nutrient-rich soil that stood in stark contrast to the surrounding ground. These soils retained fertility over long periods. They supported repeated cultivation. They resisted erosion and nutrient loss. These soils were not natural. They were created. Through generations of controlled burning, organic waste management, and careful enrichment, Casarabe communities engineered the ground beneath their feet. They turned fragile soils into long-term assets. This practice did more than support agriculture. It allowed population density. It reduced risk. It created resilience. The Casarabe were not merely adapting to the Amazon, they were redesigning it in ways that worked with its ecological limits rather than against them. And this realization forces a final shift in perspective. These communities did not fail because the Amazon was too harsh. They succeeded because they understood it. Their disappearance was not the result of environmental impossibility, but of historical catastrophe, events that unfolded rapidly after European contact, long after the system itself had proven viable. Which means the Casarabe are not evidence of what the Amazon could not sustain. They are evidence of what it once did. And the soil they left behind, still fertile centuries later, offers a rare opportunity to understand how. Because within that dark earth lies one of the most remarkable technologies ever developed in the rainforest. A technology so effective that modern science is still trying to replicate it. For a long time, the most important evidence of Amazonian civilization went unnoticed, not because it was hidden deep underground, but because it was under people's feet. Across parts of the Amazon, archaeologists began to encounter patches of soil that behaved very differently from the surrounding ground. These areas were darker, almost black in color. They were richer, more fertile, and most puzzling of all, they remained productive long after nearby soils were exhausted. Local farmers had known about this soil for generations. They called it Terra Preta, black earth. At first, scientists assumed it was natural, perhaps the result of ancient river sediments or an unusual geological process. But as samples were analyzed, that explanation fell apart. Terra Preta did not occur randomly. It appeared near ancient settlements, near former habitation sites, near places where people had lived, cooked, and worked for long periods of time. In other words, Terra Preta followed humans. Chemical analysis revealed something remarkable. This soil was not just dark, it was engineered. It contained unusually high levels of charcoal, created through low-temperature burning rather than wildfire. It was mixed with organic waste, food scraps, plant matter, animal bones, fish remains. Tiny fragments of broken pottery were embedded throughout, helping the soil retain nutrients and moisture. Over time, these components interacted to create a stable, self-sustaining system. Unlike ordinary Amazonian soils, which quickly lose fertility when cultivated, Terra Preta improved with use. It resisted nutrient loss, it supported repeated planting, and it remained productive for centuries. This should not have been possible. The Amazon is famous for its poor soils. Most nutrients are locked in living vegetation, not in the ground. Once the forest is cleared, those nutrients wash away rapidly. Agriculture becomes difficult to sustain. Terra Preta reversed that equation. It turned fragile soils into long-term assets. What makes this even more striking is the level of understanding required to create it. This was not accidental composting. It required controlled fire, repeated input, careful balance between organic material and charcoal, knowledge passed down and refined over generations. In effect, Terra Preta functioned as a form of ecological technology, not a single invention, but a process, one that transformed waste into fertility, one that stabilized food production, one that reduced the risk of failure in an unpredictable environment. And its implications are enormous. Because Terra Preta solves a problem that has long limited population growth in the Amazon. It provides a foundation for sustained agriculture. It allows communities to remain in one place. It supports density without degrading the land. This changes how we understand societies like the Casarabe. Their settlements were not temporary experiments balanced on the edge of collapse. They were built on soil that had been deliberately engineered to last. And that soil still exists. Centuries after the people who created it disappeared, Terra Preta remains fertile, often more productive than modern agricultural soils in the same region. Modern scientists have tried to replicate it, with mixed success. Despite advanced tools and controlled experiments, the precise balance achieved by ancient Amazonian communities has proven difficult to reproduce at scale, which raises a humbling realization. Long before industrial agriculture, long before chemical fertilizers, people living in the Amazon developed a sustainable system that modern science is still trying to fully understand. Terra Preta is not just a clue to the past. It is a reminder that complex knowledge does not always leave monuments. Sometimes it leaves soil. The true importance of Terra Preta becomes clear when we consider what it makes possible. Agriculture is not just about growing food. It is about reliability. For a society to grow beyond small, mobile groups, it needs consistency. Crops must survive dry seasons and floods. Fields must remain productive year after year. Surplus must exist, not occasionally, but predictably. In the Amazon, this is precisely where most farming systems fail. Clear a patch of forest and yields may be high for a short time, but without intervention, nutrients are quickly lost. The soil degrades. Fields are abandoned. Communities are forced to move. Terra Preta breaks that cycle. By locking nutrients into a stable matrix of charcoal and organic matter, this engineered soil creates a feedback loop. Waste becomes fertilizer. Fertility encourages settlement. Settlement produces more material to enrich the soil. Over time, productivity increases rather than declines. This has direct implications for population. Where ordinary Amazonian soil supports small shifting groups, Terra Preta supports density. Families can remain in place. Communities can expand. Labor can be organized around construction, infrastructure, and social life, not constant relocation. In other words, Terra Preta allows permanence in a landscape that usually discourages it. This explains how societies like the Casarabe could sustain thousands of people across interconnected settlements. Their success was not based on conquering the environment, but on redesigning its weakest point, the soil. Equally important is how Terra Preta fits into the broader Amazonian landscape. These dark earth patches are not continuous fields stretching for miles. They appear as nodes, concentrated zones of fertility near settlements, along rivers, and around activity centers. This pattern suggests a mosaic system rather than uniform farmland. Food production was likely integrated with forest management. Trees were not cleared indiscriminately. Useful species were encouraged. Gardens blended into managed forest. Agriculture, ecology, and habitation overlapped rather than competing for space. This approach is efficient in a rainforest environment. It reduces erosion, maintains biodiversity, and spreads risk across multiple food sources rather than relying on monoculture. From a modern perspective, it looks remarkably sustainable. And this is where Terra Preta challenges more than just Amazonian history. It challenges the assumption that large populations require environmental degradation. It shows that long-term productivity can be achieved through accumulation rather than extraction. That lesson has not been lost on modern researchers. Scientists today study Terra Preta not only to understand the past, but to address present-day challenges: soil degradation, carbon storage, sustainable agriculture in fragile environments. The charcoal component, now often referred to as biochar, has attracted particular interest. It sequesters carbon, improves soil structure, retains nutrients. Many of its benefits mirror those observed in ancient Amazonian soils. Yet even with modern tools, recreating Terra Preta's full effect remains difficult. Which suggests that what ancient Amazonian societies developed was not a single technique, but a system, one refined through centuries of observation, adjustment, and cultural transmission. This knowledge was not written down. It was lived, and when those societies collapsed, much of that understanding disappeared with them. What remains is the soil itself, a silent record of human ingenuity. Terra Preta tells us something essential. The Amazon did not merely tolerate human complexity. It supported it when people understood how to work within its limits. And if soil engineering made dense populations possible, then it also reshapes how we think about Amazonian cities. Because these were not cities of stone. They were something else. Distributed, integrated with forest and water, built to grow quietly, not dominate. To understand that form of urban life, we need to look beyond fields and farms, toward the settlements themselves, toward what might best be described as cities hidden in gardens. When most people hear the word city, they imagine stone, walls, streets, dense buildings packed tightly together. That image does not translate well to the Amazon, and for a long time, that mismatch led to a simple conclusion. If there were no stone cities here, then there were no cities at all. But the evidence tells a different story. Amazonian societies did not build cities against the forest. They built them within it. Instead of clearing vast areas into open fields, they shaped the landscape gradually. Settlements were embedded in managed forest. Useful trees were encouraged. Edible plants were clustered. Pathways followed natural contours rather than cutting straight lines wherever possible. What emerged was not wilderness, but neither was it an urban sprawl in the modern sense. It was a mosaic. At the center were habitation areas, raised platforms, communal spaces, and activity zones. Around them spread zones of cultivation, orchards, gardens, managed forest patches, and water systems. Beyond that lay broader areas of resource management rather than abandonment. This pattern repeats across the Amazon. LIDAR shows networks of settlements that are spaced deliberately, not randomly. Distances suggest walkable connections. Causeways link communities without forcing them into a single dense core. These were cities designed for movement, not congestion. From above, they do not announce themselves with dramatic outlines. They blend into the environment. From the ground, they feel natural. But together they form a coherent urban system, one that looks unfamiliar only because it does not resemble old-world models. Researchers often describe these systems as garden cities, not because they were small or simple, but because food production, habitation, and ecology were integrated rather than separated. In a garden city, the boundary between city and countryside dissolves. Food grows near homes. Useful plants line pathways. Forest becomes infrastructure. This approach offers clear advantages in a rainforest environment. It reduces the need for large cleared fields that quickly degrade. It spreads risk across diverse species. It allows cities to grow without triggering ecological collapse. And perhaps most importantly, it leaves few hard edges. When a stone city is abandoned, it remains visible. Walls crumble, buildings collapse. The outline persists. When a garden city is abandoned, something else happens. Trees grow taller, paths soften, structures melt back into the land. What once required constant human care begins to look like untouched forest. This is not failure. It is design. Amazonian cities were not meant to outlast their people as monuments. They were meant to function as long as they were lived in. This changes how we interpret their disappearance. They did not vanish because they were unsustainable. They vanished because the systems that maintained them were disrupted. And that disruption came suddenly. Before European contact, these garden cities had existed for centuries. They expanded slowly. They adapted to floods and droughts. They relied on knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Then disease arrived. Populations collapsed faster than landscapes could respond. Maintenance stopped. Gardens were abandoned. Causeways eroded. Forest reclaimed space that had been carefully managed for generations. To later observers, the result looked like wilderness. But it was a wilderness with memory. Subtle patterns, unusual soil, unexpected clusters of useful plants. Clues left behind by cities that were never meant to be seen from afar. To understand why these garden cities disappeared so completely and so quickly, we have to confront one of the most devastating events in human history. An event that did not leave ruins, but left silence. The strength of Amazonian garden cities was also their greatest vulnerability. They depended on people, not just to live there, but to maintain them. Paths had to be cleared, canals had to be dredged, gardens had to be tended. Forests had to be managed, not abandoned. These cities were not machines built to run on their own. They were living systems, sustained through daily human attention and long-term knowledge. As long as communities remained intact, the system worked. When those communities were disrupted, it unraveled quickly. And that is exactly what happened after European contact. Diseases carried from Europe, smallpox, measles, influenza, spread along river networks faster than any expedition could travel. Populations with no prior exposure had no immunity. Mortality rates were catastrophic. In some regions, entire communities collapsed within a few decades. The loss was not gradual, it was sudden, and it was profound. When population density dropped below a critical threshold, maintenance stopped. Fields were left untended, canals clogged with sediment, raised causeways softened under seasonal floods, managed forests began to revert. In the Amazon, this process does not take centuries, it takes years. Within a generation, gardens become thickets. Within decades, paths disappear. Within a century, the logic of the landscape is gone. What remains is forest. This explains a paradox that puzzled historians for centuries. Early European accounts describe dense populations and organized landscapes. Later travelers report emptiness. Both observations can be true. The Amazon did not gradually decline into wilderness. It was abruptly depopulated, and the forest responded with extraordinary speed. To later observers, the absence of cities seemed to confirm that none had ever existed. But this conclusion rests on a misunderstanding. Amazonian cities were not designed to survive abandonment. They were designed to survive use. Unlike stone-built cities that persist long after collapse, garden cities leave little behind once human care ends. Their materials return to the ecosystem. Their outlines blur. Their memory fades into soil, vegetation, and subtle pattern. This does not mean they were primitive. It means they were adaptive. In an environment that destroys permanence, Amazonian societies built systems that prioritized function over monumentality. They invested in knowledge, not stone, in ecology, not architecture. From a modern perspective, this choice can be difficult to recognize as civilization, but it may be one of the most sophisticated responses to a challenging environment ever developed. The disappearance of these cities was not evidence of failure. It was evidence of how tightly integrated they were with human life. When that life was removed by disease, violence, and disruption, the system had no reason to continue, and so it dissolved. The forest did not conquer these cities. It inherited them. This realization forces us to confront a difficult truth. Much of what we call wilderness today is not ancient and untouched. It is recent. It is the result of collapse, not absence. And in the Amazon, the silence we see is not the silence of a place that was never inhabited. It is the silence left after voices were suddenly gone. To understand the full scale of that loss, we must move beyond cities and soil to the event that triggered the collapse itself. An event so devastating that it reshaped an entire continent. Not through conquest alone, but through disease. When Europeans entered the Americas, they did not come alone. They carried with them an invisible force more destructive than any weapon. Disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. Illnesses that had circulated in Eurasia for centuries arrived in populations with no prior exposure and no inherited immunity. The result was not a gradual decline, but a demographic shock. In many regions of the Americas, mortality rates reached levels difficult to comprehend today. Entire communities were devastated within years. In some cases, within months. The Amazon was no exception. River systems that had once connected communities through trade and communication now became pathways for contagion. Disease traveled faster than explorers, faster than soldiers, faster than any written record.
By the time Europeans attempted to return to regions described by early explorers, much of the population had already collapsed. This helps explain a troubling pattern in historical sources. Early accounts describe populated riverbanks, cultivated landscapes, and organized resistance. Later observers report emptiness, scattered survivors, and forest reclaiming space. The gap between those descriptions is often just a few decades. From a biological perspective, this makes sense. Without immunity, smallpox alone could kill between 30 and 50% of a population in a single outbreak. Repeated waves increased that toll dramatically. Measles and influenza followed, compounding the damage. Social structures collapsed under the strain. Knowledge was lost when elders died. Agricultural systems failed when labor disappeared. Maintenance stopped when there were no longer enough people to sustain it. In the Amazon, the consequences were amplified by the environment itself. Garden cities depended on constant care. Fields required tending. Canals required clearing. Forests required management. When communities fell below a critical size, these systems could not be maintained. Abandonment followed rapidly. And abandonment in the Amazon does not look like ruins. It looks like growth. Vegetation closed in. Soil softened. Water reshaped edges. Within a generation, the visible signs of human activity faded. Within a century, entire landscapes appeared untouched. This is why the demographic collapse of the Amazon is often underestimated. Unlike stone-built civilizations, there were no ruined capitals to shock later observers, no fallen columns to measure loss. The evidence was absorbed quietly into the forest. But modern estimates suggest that pre-contact populations in the Amazon may have numbered in the millions. If that is even partially correct, the scale of the collapse rivals some of the worst demographic catastrophes in human history. This event has come to be known as the Great Death, not because it was a single moment, but because it unfolded across generations, reshaping ecosystems, cultures, and historical memory. In many regions, forest regrowth after depopulation was so extensive that it may have influenced global climate patterns, drawing carbon out of the atmosphere as vegetation expanded. Human absence changed the Earth itself. The Amazon we see today is not simply ancient wilderness. It is, in part, a post-collapse landscape, a world rebuilt by nature after the sudden removal of millions of people. This realization reframes everything that follows. The disappearance of Amazonian societies was not proof that they could not exist. It was proof that they did, and that they were destroyed by forces beyond their control. To fully understand the implications of this collapse, we must examine what was lost, not just in numbers, but in knowledge, in systems, and in ways of living that modern society is only beginning to recognize again. The consequences of the Great Death did not end with the loss of life. They reshaped memory itself. When populations collapsed, entire systems of knowledge collapsed with them. Agricultural practices, refined over centuries, disappeared. Forest management strategies were abandoned. Oral histories, never written down, ended when the last people who carried them died. What followed was not just depopulation, but forgetting. By the time European powers began to seriously document the Amazon, they were encountering a world already transformed by absence. Forests had regrown. Managed landscapes had softened into something that looked natural. Survivors were scattered, traumatized, and often displaced from their ancestral systems. To outsiders, this appeared to confirm an assumption they already held, that the Amazon had always been sparsely populated. That complex societies had never existed there. That the forest itself was the dominant force in shaping history. But this interpretation confuses cause with effect. The apparent pristine nature of the Amazon was not ancient. It was recent. In fact, much of the forest Europeans encountered was younger than they realized, regrowth following massive depopulation.
What looked like untouched wilderness was, in many places, a secondary forest, reclaiming land that had once been actively managed. This has implications far beyond regional history. As forests expanded after human collapse, they absorbed large amounts of carbon dioxide. Some researchers suggest that this regrowth may have contributed to global cooling trends observed in the centuries following European contact. Human absence altered the planet. This reframes the Amazon not as a place outside human influence, but as a landscape deeply shaped by it, first through centuries of management, then through sudden abandonment. The Great Death also distorted how later scholars interpreted evidence. When archaeologists found dark, fertile soils, they were treated as curiosities. When earthworks appeared beneath vegetation, they were dismissed as natural formations. When early accounts described dense populations, they were labeled exaggerations. The scale of loss made the truth difficult to accept. It is easier to believe that something never existed than to accept that it existed and vanished almost completely. Yet the evidence, taken together, points in one direction. The Amazon was not empty. It was emptied. And in the silence that followed, a powerful myth took hold. The myth of untouched wilderness. This myth shaped conservation policy, academic research, and popular imagination for centuries. It framed the Amazon as a place separate from human history, rather than deeply entangled with it. But myths have consequences. They obscure indigenous achievements. They erase sophisticated systems of knowledge. They limit our understanding of what sustainable human societies can look like. The Great Death did more than destroy communities. It removed a model of living that balanced human needs with ecological limits, one that modern societies are now struggling to rediscover. As researchers began to piece together the scale of what was lost, another realization emerged. The Amazon's past challenges not only how we view that region, but how we define civilization itself. If complex societies can exist without stone cities, without writing, without monuments, yet still shape landscapes sustainably for centuries, then our criteria for civilization may be far too narrow. To confront that possibility, we must revisit the story we tell about human history, not just in the Amazon, but everywhere. Because once the silence is broken, once the evidence is seen clearly, the old narrative no longer holds. History does not move only through stone and text. Sometimes it moves through soil, through forest, through absence. And when we begin to read those signs, a very different past comes into focus, one that forces us to rewrite what we thought we knew. Once the evidence is laid out, the old story of the Amazon becomes difficult to defend. LIDAR reveals engineered landscapes. Terra Preta shows deliberate soil creation. Settlement networks demonstrate planning and coordination. Historical accounts align with archaeological data when read in context. Taken together, these pieces do not describe a marginal experiment at the edge of human possibility. They describe a different model of civilization. For centuries, the dominant narrative of human progress has followed a familiar path. Civilization rises with stone architecture, centralized power, written records, and visible monuments. Societies that leave behind cities of stone are remembered. Those that do not are often overlooked. The Amazon does not fit this model. And for a long time, that mismatch was interpreted as absence. But what we are now beginning to understand is that Amazonian societies did not fail to become civilized by old world standards. They chose a different path. Their cities were not designed to dominate landscapes visually. They were designed to function within them. Infrastructure blended into ecology. Food production was distributed rather than centralized. Knowledge was embedded in practice, not carved into stone. This does not make these societies simpler. It makes them harder to see. Rewriting Amazonian history is not about elevating one region at the expense of another. It is about recognizing that complexity can take multiple forms, that human ingenuity adapts to environment rather than forcing every environment into the same template. This realization carries uncomfortable implications. If large organized societies existed in the Amazon without leaving monumental ruins, how many other regions have been misunderstood for the same reason? How much of human history has been filtered through environments that erase rather than preserve? Archaeology has always depended on survival. What lasts is studied. What decays is often forgotten. The Amazon exposes the limits of that approach. It reminds us that history is not only written by the builders of stone, but by those whose worlds were absorbed back into living systems. This shift also reframes the role of indigenous knowledge. Practices once dismissed as primitive, forest gardening, controlled burning, soil enrichment, are now recognized as sophisticated strategies with long-term ecological benefits. In some cases, they outperform modern approaches in sustainability and resilience. The implication is clear. The Amazon was not waiting to be discovered. It was already known by the people who lived there. What was missing was not civilization, but recognition. As this new understanding spreads, it forces changes in how research is conducted. Scholars are revisiting old sites, reinterpreting data, questioning assumptions that once seemed self-evident. And slowly, the picture is changing. The Amazon is no longer seen as a void between civilizations. It is emerging as one of the great centers of human adaptation, a place where societies solved problems that modern civilization still struggles with today. How to support large populations without destroying ecosystems, how to integrate food production with biodiversity, how to build cities that disappear without poisoning the land. These are not ancient questions. They are modern ones. And the answers may lie not in the future, but in a past we are only now beginning to understand. Rewriting the history of the Amazon does more than correct a regional misunderstanding. It forces a reassessment of how we recognize civilization itself. For a long time, complexity has been measured by visibility. Cities were judged by their walls, power by monuments, knowledge by writing carved into durable surfaces. Societies that fit this template became central to history. Those that did not were pushed to the margins. The Amazon challenges that hierarchy. Here, complexity was expressed through systems rather than structures, through long-term ecological management rather than permanent stone, through practices that worked precisely because they blended into the environment instead of standing apart from it. When judged by old world standards, these societies appear invisible. When judged by function, they appear remarkably advanced. They sustained large populations without exhausting the land. They adapted to floods without massive fortifications. They integrated agriculture, habitation, and forest into a single working system, and they did so for centuries. This reframes a fundamental assumption that civilization must impose itself on nature to succeed. In the Amazon, success came from the opposite approach. Nature was not conquered, it was partnered with. This has implications far beyond archaeology. Modern societies face many of the same challenges Amazonian cultures once addressed: soil degradation, biodiversity loss, unsustainable agriculture, urban expansion that overwhelms ecosystems. The Amazonian response was not technological dominance, but ecological intelligence. Knowledge accumulated slowly, practices refined over generations. Feedback from the environment was incorporated rather than ignored. These systems did not scale through centralization alone. They scaled through replication, networks of communities applying similar principles across large regions. From a modern perspective, this looks less like an empire and more like a resilient network. And that distinction matters. It suggests that human progress does not move along a single path. There are multiple ways to organize society, multiple ways to achieve stability, and multiple definitions of success. The Amazon was not a failed attempt at civilization. It was a successful attempt at something else. The reason it disappeared from history is not because it collapsed on its own terms, but because it was destroyed by forces that arrived too quickly for adaptation. Disease, disruption, demographic collapse. The silence that followed made it easy to forget what had existed before. But forgetting is not the same as erasure. The evidence remained in soil chemistry, in subtle earthworks, in plant distributions that still reflect human preference centuries later. Modern tools have simply allowed us to read that evidence again, and as we do, the Amazon moves from the margins of history toward the center of a much larger conversation. Not about lost cities in the romantic sense, but about lost knowledge. Knowledge of how to live densely without destruction, how to build cities that leave no scars, how to leave landscapes capable of recovery. These are lessons with urgency today. Rewriting history is not about nostalgia. It is about expanding our understanding of what humanity has already achieved and what it might achieve again. The Amazon's past does not offer a blueprint to copy, but it offers proof. Proof that alternative models of civilization are possible. Proof that complexity does not require domination. Proof that sustainability can be the product of design, not limitation. And once that proof is accepted, the final question becomes unavoidable. If we have misunderstood the Amazon for centuries, what else have we misunderstood? Even now, what we know about the Amazon is only a fraction of what once existed. LIDAR has transformed our vision, but it has not come close to covering the entire basin. Only small areas, carefully selected and limited by funding, logistics, and politics, have been scanned in detail. The vast majority of the Amazon remains unseen, and that fact alone should give us pause. Each time a new region is surveyed, familiar patterns emerge. Earthworks where none were expected, settlement networks hidden beneath vegetation, subtle modifications that point to long-term human presence. The discoveries are no longer surprising. What is surprising is how consistently they appear. This suggests that societies like the Casarabe were not isolated exceptions. They were part of a broader tapestry of Amazonian cultures, each adapted to local conditions, each leaving behind landscapes shaped more by intention than chance. If that is true, then what we have uncovered so far is not the story. It is the introduction. Because between the known sites lie vast areas of forest that have never been examined with modern tools. Regions where historical accounts hint at population, but archaeology has yet to confirm it. Places where oral traditions speak of former settlements, long reclaimed by vegetation. In many cases, those areas are difficult to study for reasons beyond science. Dense forest, seasonal flooding, remoteness, legal protections, political boundaries. And yet, beneath those constraints, the ground remains, waiting. What makes this moment unique is not just technology, but timing. As deforestation accelerates in parts of the Amazon, previously hidden features are sometimes exposed accidentally, cut by roads, revealed by erosion, or uncovered during development. In some cases, ancient earthworks are destroyed before they are even recognized. This creates a paradox. The same forces that threaten the Amazon are also revealing how deeply human its past truly is. And that realization carries responsibility. If the Amazon is not simply wilderness, but a cultural landscape shaped over millennia, then protecting it is not just about preserving nature. It is about preserving history. Not history written in stone or text, but history written into soil, water, and forest structure. The question, then, is not whether more discoveries will be made. They will. The question is how many will be recognized before they disappear again. Because unlike stone ruins, Amazonian evidence is fragile. Once disturbed, it does not leave behind dramatic remains. It vanishes quietly, just as it did after the Great Death. This means the future of Amazonian history depends on learning to see differently, to recognize patterns instead of monuments, to value absence as much as presence, to accept that complexity does not always announce itself. The Amazon still holds answers, not in the form of lost golden cities waiting to be uncovered, but in landscapes that tell a subtler story, one of adaptation, restraint, and long-term thinking.
And perhaps that is why these societies remained hidden for so long. They were never meant to be remembered through ruins. They were meant to be lived in. In the end, the Amazon does not confront us with a lost civilization in the way we expect. There are no towering ruins rising above the trees, no stone capitals waiting to be uncovered, no inscriptions announcing who ruled, when, and for how long. Instead, the Amazon offers something more difficult. It asks us to reconsider what we mean by history. For centuries, we believed that what endured mattered most, that permanence was proof of importance, that civilizations which left monuments deserved attention, while those that faded into the land did not. The Amazon quietly rejects that idea.
Its past was not written in stone, but in systems. In soil engineered to last, in forests shaped to feed generations, in networks of communities designed to grow, adapt, and disappear without poisoning the land they depended on. These societies did not fail to leave a mark. They chose a different kind of mark, one that blended into the living world rather than standing above it. That choice made them nearly invisible to later observers. It allowed myths of emptiness to take root. It encouraged the belief that the Amazon had always been what it appeared to be, a vast, untouched wilderness. But now, that illusion is breaking. With each new discovery, the silence of the forest feels less like absence and more like memory. The ground tells a story when we learn how to read it. The forest reveals intention when we stop assuming randomness, and what it reveals is unsettling. Not because it suggests something mysterious or unknowable, but because it suggests something familiar. That humans once lived here in balance, that they supported large populations without collapse, that they understood limits and designed within them. These are not exotic achievements, they are human ones. The Amazon's forgotten societies remind us that history is not a straight line toward domination and expansion. It is a branching path, filled with experiments, some loud, some quiet. We remember the loud ones. The quiet ones are easier to miss. Yet, in an era defined by environmental strain and uncertainty, it may be the quiet solutions that matter most. Not the civilizations that built the tallest monuments, but those that left behind living landscapes capable of recovery. The Amazon does not offer nostalgia. It offers perspective. It shows us that complexity does not require conquest, that permanence is not the only measure of success, that a society can vanish without being a failure. Much of the Amazon's past remains unfound, not because it is gone, but because it does not announce itself. It waits in subtle patterns, in dark soil beneath the forest floor, in the shape of land that looks natural until you know what to look for. And perhaps that is the final lesson. History does not always survive as ruins. Sometimes it survives as restraint. Sometimes it survives as silence. And sometimes the most advanced societies are the ones that leave the lightest trace, visible only when we learn to see the world differently.